The next event that we will highlight is Jesus foretelling his death and his resurrection. From this point, Jesus began to reveal to the disciples plain, matter-of-fact statements concerning the reality of his approaching suffering, death, and resurrection. It was necessary for the sake of their understanding to speak openly about this matter. And in the midst of the impending storm of tragedy, Jesus arched the rainbow of his resurrection. But as of yet, the disciples saw only the blackness of the clouds. Jesus stated 4 things about his future. Number 1, he must leave in a little while for Jerusalem. It was impossible that a prophet should perish outside of that city. The corporate murders of the prophets. Number 2, he must suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. Thirdly, he must be killed. And finally, he would be resurrected. Jesus repeatedly emphasized these facts to the 12 apostles, trying to get them to understand. And at this juncture, Peter rebuked the Lord, saying, "Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee." Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men." Peter had inadvertently placed himself on the side of the great adversary by thinking after the manner of men instead of thinking according to the things of God. Jesus then reveals to the disciples the cost of discipleship. In the light of his impending death, Jesus now began teaching the 12 the principles that the cross-bearing is the fundamental law of discipleship. And to be a disciple, one must take up his cross day by day, deny himself, and follow Christ. We then have the transfiguration of Jesus Christ. And during the 6 or 8 days that followed the first lesson on the principle of the cross, Jesus went over and over the facts with the disciples, seeking to enlighten them, but they were ill-prepared to receive it, and they were unwilling really to accept it. Jesus finally took Peter, James, and John up into the lofty Mount Hermon, and upon arrival there, they were weary and weighed down with sleep. Jesus prayed, and while he prayed, he was transfigured before them. His very raiment kindled to the dazzling brightness of the light, and his face was shining like the sun. And this was a rending of the human veil to reveal the glory of God in Christ. In a glorious display of eternal majesty, deity broke through the flesh and shone out. It continues to break through to those who want to see it today. Otherwise, men will never see Jesus for who he really is. Aroused from sleep by the splendor, the disciples were filled with awe and dazzled by his glory. And then there appeared unto them 2 men, Moses and Elijah. And they stood with Jesus discussing his imminent suffering and death in Jerusalem. And those 3 disciples were overcome with awe. As the vision began to fade, though, Peter, not really understanding what he was saying, he exclaimed, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you will, allow us to make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elias." And as Peter spoke, a white cloud of God's Shekinah glory descended on them and completely covered them. And suddenly a voice came out of the midst of the cloud, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." The transfiguration taught the disciples that vicarious suffering and death were not incompatible with the Old Testament concept of the spiritual Messiah. The voice from heaven confirmed their confession of Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God. And Jesus charged them to tell no man about the vision until he should arise from the dead. This experience strengthened them greatly during the devastation that lay ahead and clarified their understanding of the resurrection. But at the time of the transfiguration, they just went along the way, discussing among themselves what rising from the dead should really mean. We next have the healing of the demoniac boy. While Jesus went on Mount Hermon, the place of transfiguration, a man brought his son to be healed of demon possession. And in the absence of the master, the 9 remaining apostles who'd been commissioned to perform similar miracles in the Galilean campaign undertook to cast the demon from the boy. However, they failed. They could do nothing for him. At one time they had power over demons, but now they had no power. What had happened? When Jesus came down to where the 9 were, the man said, "Lord, if you can." The lack of faith of the 9 reflected on Jesus. Of course he could. Only one stronger than a strong man could bind the demon, and that man was God manifested in human flesh. Yet the lack of power among the 9 apostles hindered this man's faith. And so Jesus put the "if" where it belonged. He said, "If you believe." The poor father had hinged the case on the ability of Jesus to cure, but Jesus returned the responsibility to him, making it depend on his faith. The man recognized that his faith was utterly weak, and in desperation he cried out, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." And in response, Jesus healed the boy. The disciples later asked why they could not cast out the demon, and Jesus replied that such acts come only as the result of prayer and fasting. And this should be a lesson for all Christians to learn. When we neglect to pray and fast, we lose power with God. The period of comparative isolation was now drawing to a close in the life of Jesus. Through the experiences of nearly 6 months, Jesus had led his apostles to a more intimate understanding of his own nature and of the true character of his kingdom. He now returned through Galilee for a brief stay in Capernaum before going on to Judea for his last ministry and final struggle in Jerusalem.